Well, it's such a thrill, Les, to have you back on the podcast. Welcome back.
It's great to be back, Carey. I've always enjoyed our conversations.
Well, you've helped a lot of leaders, and why don't we start here? For those who, just give us the real quick summary of the body of your work. First time you were here. Today we're going to talk about scale and what are the keys to scaling. But we talked about predictable success and the 7 phases that every organization, business, startup, church, if those of you who are transitioning organizations, that was the first episode, the first time I had you on. And last time we talked about teams and visionaries, operators, and processors. And again, these are matrices that I have in my head. They're just part of my working knowledge, and they're part of any team I'm involved in. It's like, do you think that organization's in treadmill? You think that church is in death rattle? Are we in startup? Are we in fun? Operator, visionary, processor, they've been so helpful for literally tens of thousands of leaders who listen to this podcast. But give us the elevator pitch on both of those, because they, I think, set up what we're going to talk about with scale so well.
Sure. Well, as you beautifully summarized there, Carey, essentially my life's work is helping leaders grow their organizations. That's what I do. I got into it, fell into it by being a serial entrepreneur, though it was so long ago we didn't have that phrase back then. Started over 40 businesses myself. And as I say to people, even a dumb Irishman, which is what I am, is going to start seeing repeating patterns if you do something that frequently. And I did. I started to see frequent patterns, stuff that repeated over and over again in growing organizations. Began to realize that this was something that, if I dug deep enough, was a holistic model, not something I invented, just something that I recognized. And what I've essentially done for folks is put together shared vocabulary. I've found intuitive ways to describe something that almost everybody I work with says, I think I knew that. I just didn't know how to express it. And now I know at the stage I'm in is fun. It is fun, right? And then I hit whitewater, and that's what it felt like. So what I've done essentially is I've recognized what the patterns of growth are in any sort of organization, for profit or not for profit. I've codified it, and now I help leaders take that methodology and use it to grow their organizations.
Yeah. So can you give us just real quick, the 7 stages of predictable success is in the middle, but basically your work in that area. So every organization goes through 7 stages. Because when I read that for the first time and reached out to you, I'm like, my whole leadership life flashed before my eyes. Like you've described every situation I've ever been in. I've seen this all over the place. And again, I think you were able to name what every leader experiences.
Sure. So the 7 stages, if you think of an arc, it's like lobbing a ball, goes up in the air and comes back down again. Growth life cycle is exactly the same. So we've got 7 stages. There are 3 that are growth stages. The peak stage, predictable success, talk about in a second or so. And then there are 3 decline stages. What's really important to bear in mind before I go through them, however, is that unlike a human life cycle, you don't have to, as an organization, go through the decline phases. What my life's work about is trying to help people not begin that slide, that decline. So the stages are, first of all, early struggle. That's what it is, early struggle. Mm-hmm. It's a struggle to find a market. If it's a commercial organization, a market for your product or services. If you're a cause-based organization, it might sound mercenary, but it's a market for what you're trying to do and achieve. So early struggle, it's probably the second, it's the second most dangerous stage for any organization, because the mortality rate is so high. 80% of all new ventures fail in the first 3 years. For the 20% that make it, and we might touch briefly in a minute or two about what makes it and what doesn't make it, but the 20% that make it, they hit the first real growth stage. I call it fun, because that's what it is. It's the stage that feels most natural. It's like, okay, that's what we were here for. We did it. We found our market. Let's go. Let's open another campus. Let's bring water to, 17 states that don't have water. Let's sell more plastic extrusion than the world could ever use. It just feels like fun. We've found our market, and we've got a lot of low-hanging fruit, and we get very evangelical, and we grow like crazy. And then at some point, that very growth brings with it complexity. Our organization has grown, it's become more complex. We were running up using our gut. Board meeting was a ride up in the elevator during fun. We just made decisions on the fly, made them happen overnight, and then complexity slows us down. we hit a stage I call whitewater. And in whitewater, we just start dropping the ball. That visceral way of running the organization begins to tap out. We can't just think that we have got the golden gut answer to everything. We've got to do something that feels a little unnatural at the start, which is to put systems and processes in place. We've got to start owning information. We've got to start knowing more than just what our gut tells us. And so we've got a choice at that point. Do we want to do that? Or do we just want to go back to fun? That's a perfectly fine thing to do. You can just say, wait a minute, I don't like this, and I don't want to go any further with it. I liked it the way it was. And so you go back, but you got to accept there'll always be a cap in your growth if you do that. And you think about most mom and pop businesses, classic example of businesses that have decided to stay in fun. They want it that way. The little donut shop that you go to, you know, they don't want to be Dunkin' Donuts. They just want to have 1, 2, 3 units. But if you decide you want to keep growing, you've got to get through whitewater. Calls for putting in systems and processes, but also calls for a big behavioral mindset change, which is really what the second book is all about, to move into predictable success. And predictable success is the apex. The difference between it and fun is that fun has always got a cap, as we've seen, and how you can grow. Predictable success, we've now put the systems and processes in place that allow us to scale to whatever size our industry or our market will allow. Right. We'll talk, I'm sure, a bit more about that in a minute or two.
Is it correct, Les? This is the way I think of it. I just want to make sure I'm accurate when I share this with my team. But it is, you hold in tension the entrepreneurial zeal, that's not gone. The ideas, that the culture with the systems. So the problem with fun is it's all ideas, it's just working, but it doesn't grow. It's not scalable. It stays small. And then the problem on the other side of decline is you have all systems, but the entrepreneurs are all gone. Is that right?
Correct. Yeah, in fun, you do grow. There's no doubt about it. You grow like crazy, but the way you're doing it is, shall we say, I don't know if you've ever seen 6-year-olds play soccer.
Yeah,
Terry. I mean,
yeah,
it's flock ball, right? It's just 22 players, including both goalkeepers, in one heap, and the ball is under there somewhere, and there's a dust cloud above them, and wherever the ball goes, they go. And that's how we grow in fun. We just massive effort towards stuff, and it's fantastic, all that entrepreneurialism and all the rest of it. You're quite right. In predictable success, we're saying, no, wait a minute, that's not enough anymore. We actually trip over ourselves. I mean, you can imagine a bunch of 6-year-olds or even a semi-professional team with that approach, playing a team that knows how to play soccer, keeps to their positions, let the ball do the work. You get skinned alive. Predictable success is learning to play soccer at a professional level. I don't want to stretch that analogy too far. Yeah. But if we keep that tension right, we can stay there in predictable success indefinitely. But the reality is, as you just teased out, what tends to happen is the same thing that happens when we do any good thing. We just did something that was painful, bringing in systems and processes, but it was really good. It helped us to get to this next stage in growth, the ability to scale and predictable success. So guess what? Let's do some more. We'll put some more systems and processes in place. We start to do, Kaizens. We have lean manufacturing. We bring in more and more systems and processes, and that's what tilts us over into the decline stage. At first, we fall into a stage I call treadmill, sort of the mirror opposite of whitewater. Whitewater, we were for the first time the under-processed organization. Here in treadmill, for the first time, we're the over-processed organization. It's just getting sluggish. We're getting a little arthritic. We're getting, it's a little hard to get decisions made. It's very hard to get them implemented. We're making people jump through hoops. Checklists are appearing all over the place. We talk about compliance a lot. But that's a natural thing to have happen. But it is an absolutely existential moment in the existence of the organization. And you can see this in for-profits, you see it in churches, you see it in faith-based organizations. There's a critical decision to be made, which most people don't realize needs to be made, which is this. In treadmill, you can still recover. In treadmill, you can self-diagnose and you can say, this is crazy. Why should somebody have to fill in 13 fields in an online form just for us to contact them, right? Yeah. This is stupid. First name, email address. In treadmill, you can take your foot off the brake, which is what it feels like when you've got too many systems and processes, and you can go back into predictable success. But if you don't, the organization will continue to decline, will fall into a stage which I call the big rut. The big rut. Mm-hmm. And essentially in the big rut, we lose the ability to self-diagnose. we like it like this. Everybody's in a comfort zone. Customers, the people that we serve, they're a pain in the neck. We have everything working perfectly. If you want to see the big rut in action, this is a little unfair because I'm sure it doesn't apply everywhere, but go to your local DMV. It's just, follow the system. Don't smile. Don't talk to me. You sit there for 4 hours and then we maybe give you your driver's license. Organizations in the big rut, they have lost the ability to self-diagnose and they've become completely bureaucratic. Everything follows a standard pattern and there's no deviance. Challenge factor gets squeezed out. Anybody who's got the gall to question stuff gets squeezed out. And essentially, we're just sitting there on a long, slow decline to irrelevance. Why is it long and slow? It usually is. Sometimes it's precipitous, but usually it's long and slow. Why? Because we were in predictable success for a long time. You had a bunch load of money. We've got very big, very fat. We've got a big balance sheet. You make a lot of money in treadmill. You can become very successful. We see it in the church world as well. A lot of places just sitting around, slowly sliding into decline. Not going to disappear tomorrow, but generationally, they're not going to be around in the long term.
Yeah, and they got money in the bank and they're sitting on real estate and they got 30 people left. 100%.
And everybody's comfortable and they don't want any change and they fear that change. And so it becomes a self-filtering group of people and eventually you hit the final stage, which I call death rattle, in which it looks like something might be happening, but it's not. We're just putting this thing to bed. It's finally disappearing. We saw 2 good examples over years. Kodak, going the whole way through that arc. Kodak in my childhood, they owned film, as they called it back then. They should have actually, in retrospect, owned imaging, but they owned the old mechanical ways of taking photographs. Kodak they owned it. They're dead now. RIM, the BlackBerry manufacturer, another good example of an organization that's gone the whole way through. So that is one part of the model. The second part of the model then is what are the underlying big things that make those changes happen, that move organizations through that. And you know what I discovered? It's the people who are running the organizations. And in the second book, then I talk about the 4 styles, that the mix of which is essentially the key thing that dictates where you get to in that cycle. And it's the hardest thing in moving from one part of the predictable success life cycle to another is understanding the behavioral shifts that are needed. The mechanistic shifts are tough enough. You've got to put these systems and processes in place, and then you've got to dismantle them when you need to. But the thing that's really hardest for most folks is the 4 inches between their ears. It's, Marshall Goldsmith has a book with a great title, What Got You Here Won't Get You There. And that's the constant challenge of organizational growth. The very things that were a success and were vital and necessary, for example, in fun, become a barrier to growth when you're trying to get to predictable success.
Because visionaries love fun, right? Like there are, sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off, but Skype, it's always fun. I know a lot of people listening to this podcast, they would be visionaries and operators. So these are the people who start things, who come alongside entrepreneurs, founders, transitioners. And I'm a visionary. I did your assessment. We'll link to all this in the show notes to the previous episodes, the previous work. But if you're going to live in predictable success, you need to have a synergistic style where you have visionaries, operators, and processors. I want to get to scale, but can you give us the elevator pitch definition of a visionary, an operator, a processor? And then the Synergist style. And then I want to jump right into scaling up, because this is your latest work and your latest research that I want to dive into.
And it's all integrated. It's all one model. It's like going to a Neil Young concert. It's all one song, The
that
material
is very
here
true. That's very true.
Do scale is an integral. It's a sort of a more in-depth dive into the predictable success stage, but we'll talk about that in a second or two. And sure, so we've got these 4 styles, and there's a choreography, there's a cadence with which they've got to arrive for optimal success, and it goes like this. Visionary is the first one to start thinking about starting a new venture. It's such a risk-taking thing. You've got to be driven to do it. It's one of the reasons why, as an aside, in recessions, it's really unfortunate. A lot of people start businesses that because of necessity, and they're not actually visionaries driven to do it. And then the mortality rate jumps. So visionaries are people who will willingly go do something that's got an 80% chance of failing, right? Because they're driven by this vision. Most visionaries start things because of the need for freedom and autonomy. It's not for the monetary reward, though that comes pretty high up the list. It's the need to do things their own way. See that a lot in the church world. Church planting happens a lot by visionaries saying, I want to do this my way, except sometimes in the church world, we bring God into that equation. And
sometimes it's a very fine line, Les. It's a very fine line.
We might dance across both sides of the line. But anyway, visionaries are the folks that are driven to do something because of a need for freedom and autonomy. So they get started, and very early on, the successful visionaries recognize, this is great, but here's something I know about myself. I'm not great with the detail. I can do it if I have to, but it drives me crazy. I want to get on to the next big thing. I want to get to the 30,000 foot level. So they intuitively go find people that I call operators. And operators, a visionary is essentially a starter. A visionary gets an endorphin rush by thinking about something. Starting it is wonderful. An operator gets their endorphin rush by finishing stuff. That's what they want to do, is to do things. They get stuff done. Sometimes they don't say stuff. They get stuff done. And visionaries and operators are a symbiotic link. They really work well together. They're a wonderful team. And so visionary with operators, that's how you grow the organization through fun. And at this stage, the visionary is playing the role of a conductor. It's essentially bringing in an operator to run this part of the organization, another operator to do the youth ministry, this operator be our admin person, here's our marketing person. And we bring a bunch of operators, and the visionary conducts the orchestra. And that's how we grow the organization during fun. And it's fantastic, and it's great fun, and I love it. There's not a darn thing wrong with being there. However, the challenge comes when we hit whitewater, because neither the visionary nor the operator get any endorphin rush by installing, and adhering to systems and processes. It drives them crazy. Mm-hmm. The visionary, because they want what? Freedom and autonomy, and systems and processes curtail their freedom and autonomy. The operator loathes systems and processes for a different reason, because they see them as getting in the way of getting stuff done. An operator, you ask them to fill in a spreadsheet, they'd rather open a paper clip and stab themselves in the eye. It's just painful for an out-and-out operator to do that. And so there is where the first battle comes in, is that we've got to go get people who are good at that. We call them processors in the model. They could be your accounting people, your legal people, your quality people, your warehousing people, whatever it is that you need to bring systems and processes in place. You bring these folks in, and we have our first cultural clash of material scale, because now we've got a conflict going on. And it's all about, do we over V this thing, go back to fun, or do we over P this thing and head towards treadmill? And that's where, if you want to get to predictable, the decision at this point is, I can't be doing with this. Get rid of those folks. Let's go back to fun. And then we realize we grow again. We hit whitewater. We need some processors. At some point, you recognize if we're going to get to predictable success and get the ability to scale, we need to integrate the processor role, embrace it, not just put up with it. And that's where the fourth role comes in, because then a fourth learned style, the other three roles, visionary, operator, processor, all natural styles. We come out of the womb with some version of those, but there's a learned style. That style is the style I call the Synergist style. And that Synergist style is the recognition that these three roles are equally important if we're going to scale. That it's not a question of the processor being a secondary citizen in service to the visionary and operators who, because of all the glory days they had, have got all sorts of status and authority in the organization. It's a recognition that the processor role is just as important. And without the synergist binding that team together, we'll just end up with this triangular three-way argument all of the time. And so those four roles are the roles that get us into predictable success and give us the ability to do what I talk about in Do Scale, which is the ability to scale.
Well, and that is so helpful. So for some listeners, this will be the first introduction to that material. I would encourage you, we'll link to it in the show notes, to go back to the previous episodes. Or the easy way to do it is just Google my name and Les's name, and it'll come up. It's McKeown, but it's M small c capital Keown, correct?
Correct.
You will find that. And I would say, like, that was a great overview, but there is so much more there. And your books are worth purchasing on that too. And I would say, just as a leader who's been in this almost a quarter century now in senior leadership, the appreciation for process was my toughest thing to do. Because I would rather never have spreadsheets, never have the fine print. I don't want any of that stuff. And to realize, there's the ceiling. If we don't have this is the ceiling. We'll never reach more people. We'll never be able to see what the potential of this is. And that was a slow learn, and I found your material so helpful. And now I want to flip things to talk about scale, because we've got business leaders, church leaders listening who are thinking about new locations. And, in church world, there's a huge difference between 3 locations and 5. That seems to be a tipping point between, 7 and 12, between 12 and 20, which is where some churches are getting to now. And there always seems to be that tipping point. Similarly, we've had entrepreneurs on this show, and, they're now in 17 states, or they're getting to that scale thing. And I know there's a lot of young leaders listening who have dreams. And I want to drill down on scale. So you have a very precise definition of scale, and I want you to share it with us. So what do you mean by scale? Because I think of scale, and my little tiny, brain says bigger. But it's way more nuanced than that.
Sure. And that's one of the key reasons I wrote the book, is that what I recognized is that there's an enormous degree of confusion about what we mean when we talk about scaling. Some people just mean getting very big. Some people think it's getting very big very fast. Some people think it's being bigger than what I currently am. And so I have found myself over the years having discussions with people who are talking about scaling when really what they're talking about is just growing through fun. And scaling is a very different thing. Scaling, and let me back up to the definition if I can. So let me talk a little bit about what we're talking about. Growth, the organic growth that we get in the early stages through fun is what you can think of as an arc. It's the ability to grow, but the rate of growth is typically evening off. As you get bigger through fun, the ability to get bigger and bigger gets harder and harder because of this need for systems and processes. You decide to just stay in fun. You actually put a cap on your growth. Nothing wrong with that. It's a decision I've made personally. There's no ethical judgment, but it's a decision about what level of growth you can get to. I'm a single consultant. I'm not going to be Bain and Company. I'm not going to have offices all over the world. I've done that in the past. I know what that's like. I've chosen to stay in fun. So I've by nature put a cap on growth. If, on the other hand, as I did do many times, and as most of the people I work with want to do, you want to go through predictable success, through Whitewater to get into predictable success. You come out with the ability to get onto a different curve, which is sometimes called a J curve. And it's the rate of growth that's actually increasing over time. The rate in which you're growing is getting faster and faster.
So it's almost like hockey stick growth. Sometimes I've heard that call.
That's a phrase that's often used.
Yeah.
And that's a very specific thing. If you go back to the example that you talked about a moment ago, if you're running a fast-growing church and you're finding, and you're quite right, there's a stretch between 3 and up, and it's the same thing actually with retail outlets. You move between 3 to 5. It's a big distinction, big difference. You're running a little mom-and-pop restaurant, and you open your 4th outlet, it becomes a big deal. You don't have the ability to scale at that stage. If you're moving from 12 to 17 and it's still highly problematic and stretching you like crazy, you haven't yet got the ability to scale. Because the ability to scale says we can grow, and this is my definition in the book, we can grow to whatever size our industry or the market we serve will allow us. Wow. We can grow to whatever size our market or industry that we serve will allow us. Doesn't mean you have to go to the biggest size. That's dominating, which is a subset of scaling, but you can. And a way to look at it is this. Whenever we're building our organization in fun, I want you to think about the industry or the market you serve as a massive skyscraper, 160 floors high. I think there's one in Dubai. In fun, during organic growth, the way we're getting up that building is running up the stairwell. That's essentially what it is, right? Yeah. We just run up the stairwell. Yeah, what are we going to do this week? Let's go up to the 5th floor. We can run up there.
First few floors are always fun.
And the first floors are it's charge, and we're all running behind, and the visionary leaders all up there. And then you get up a few steps, and I don't care how fit you are, and you're starting to get a little tired. So you flag a little bit, and you stop, and you have an off year, and things are quieter, and you gather your resources, and the money's got tight, and then you big deep breath, charge, let's go up another couple of stairs. The ability to scale is the ability to walk in, punch the floor in the elevator, and go there. No drain on your resources, because you've got the process and systems to take you there. And the big problem is this, and it's what the book is all about, is that nobody hands us a building with the elevator. We've got to build the elevator, right? We've got to build the elevator. That's what the whole process and system, the whole transition and transformation in Whitewater is all about. It's building an elevator that will allow us to scale. And behaviorally, we keep wanting to run back out and go up a couple more flights of stairs, because there's immediate gratification, first of all. And secondly, it's what we did for many years. And just sticking to our last and saying, no, wait a minute, we just got to build this darn thing. And then this all becomes an awful lot easier. That's the hardest part of that transformation.
Well, and I guess what you're saying, just to give some real world examples, and I'm just testing these, you can tell me if it's right or wrong, but it would be the difference between the regional coffee shop that has one outlet in Portland to all of a sudden, we have 5 across the city, but it's the ability to really become Starbucks. That's what Starbucks did, right? It's like the market will bear in whatever countries. I've met a couple times with the senior leadership team of Chick-fil-A. And you look at that story over the last 50 years, they went from Atlanta to the South to America. And I met with some of their team in Toronto recently. They're opening Toronto locations this summer and looking at globally expanding. But they had to build that skyscraper. Or Life Church in the church world, probably, with over 30 locations now, that's how they're reaching 100,000 people on some weekends, is they've figured out, okay, now we have a replicatable system. And I've had Jerry Hurley and Craig Rochelle and Bobby Grunwald on previous episodes. We'll link in the show notes. And again, that's not for everybody, but there is, I imagine there are a measurable number, probably hundreds, if not thousands of listeners right now who are right between that first and the third coffee shop, the first and the third location, the third and the fifth, and they're getting tired climbing those stairs.
Correct. And so it's time to put that elevator in place. But what you can do, to flesh out the full paragraph of the definition, what I say is that scaling is the ability to grow to whatever size your industry or market will allow in whatever footprint you choose to engage in. So you don't have to immediately, Chick-fil-A didn't suddenly become the 3rd largest operator after Starbucks and McDonald's. They built up regionally, first of all. They built the elevator that they could operate in you should think of a 20-story building. You build an elevator that takes you there. That's absolutely fine. And you can choose to stop at that point. There are a number of great, you go to Caribou Coffee, really, really great in a particular region. They're not national, they're not global, but they've really got a great reputation regionally. So you can choose just to operate locally, and you can stay in fun, typically locally. You can choose to go statewide, and I'm just using geographical things here. We can make other distinctions, but you can go statewide, and then you're teetering on the brink. You can just probably serve a small state in fun. Once you want to go regional, you've made a decision. You've got to put an elevator in place. You've got to be able to scale into the region. Go from region to national. You can go from national to global. So you don't have to immediately decide we're going to be the next Chick-fil-A. But, if you're going to grow outside of local and probably state, you need to put that elevator in place. Now, will you come back and retool that to take you further up? Almost certainly. But by that point, you've learned the principles. You understand what the behavioral shifts that are needed. It's much easier to go, for example, from regional to national, or even national to global, than making that first shift from fun into predictable success. In predictable success, you can do this 2-3 times, get bigger, bigger, bigger. It's that first shift, because it's such a big change in mindset particularly for the visionary and operators. And that's what I'm trying to do in Do Scale. I'm trying to point out very clearly for those of you Do scale is not for, it's going to yield most for people who aren't yet there and who for the first time really want to scale, because it's showing you what the revelatory binary shifts are that you need to make if you're going to succeed in that.
Well, I feel like I've listened to a million resources on scale because I'm pretty tuned into what's happening in the tech industry, Silicon Valley, listened to a lot of podcasts, read a lot of books. And what's helpful to me, Les, about the way you think about it is I just assume that growth and scale are two sides of the same thing. And you're saying, no. And I think that's what's exhausting a lot of the leaders I meet is, they think, well, look at how big we got. We have 50% growth, 30% growth, 20% growth, whatever, 100% growth. So we're scaling, but it's a different thing. It's a very different thing.
If you're getting 20% growth, 30% growth, even 100% growth, and it's overwhelming you, then you're not scaling. You're growing.
Right.
But it's not scaling. Scaling is a controlled thing. And I do want to make one distinction. Again, one of the reasons I wrote the book is I think we're being terribly ill-served by people like me who commentate and write about startups, growth, that whole area. What I'm talking about is sustainable scalability. There's another thing, I call it flipping in the book, which is flipping are essentially the unicorn stories we hear about all the time that make everybody massively envious, though they refuse to say so. And everybody wants to be the next Uber of everything, right? I don't think there's a single industry or market where I haven't heard somebody say, we're going to be the next Uber of this. You know what? Uber has never, ever made a penny.
No, and as we record this, their stock is tanking right now.
Their IPO just went out, and they actually, and I don't hold me 100% to this, but I'm 99% sure that they actually said in their transaction document and filing for the IPO that they have no plans to ever make a profit. That's artificial growth. That's buying the market. You can only do that for so long. I'm talking about building a legacy, building sustainable growth, building something that you can be proud of, building something that's going to be there when you disappear, something that, isn't just buying some artificial growth. I'm talking about doing something that builds on the organic growth of the early stages of your organization and you can be proud of doing.
Yeah, and not exhaust your team. I think I run into so many leaders who are scaling, growing, starting, transitioning. And that's for all of you who are turning churches around or organizations, businesses around. And they're just, man, I'm just dead. I'm so tired. The team's burning out. We're losing staff, high turnover. I want to go there. What are some reasons companies either don't scale or they end up scaling really poorly, Les?
Well, I think you've hit on it. The last section, let me just back up and then come to the direct answer to your question. The book's really in three parts. To talk about the mechanics, first of all. That's the easiest part is, what mechanically, how do we make this happen? Then I talk about the mindset, and we've been dipping in and out of that. But at the end, I talk about building what I call building scalable people, which sounds a bit like Lego bricks, but what I see over and over again in organizations is a lack of understanding on the part of the leaders as to what they need from their people for the organization to be scalable. A lot of leaders I see, particularly visionary leaders, operators are the same thing. I think if they just shout harder, run faster, do more, that will scale. That scale is somehow an arithmetic formula. If I just do more of this, we'll get there. And there's actually a complete shift that needs to happen. And the bit of the iceberg above the surface level, it's recognizing that you as the visionary leader in particular know possibly least of all what's really happening in major parts of your organization if it's truly scaling. And so we got to build people who are capable of doing one thing. And I'm about to tell you the most soporific thing ever. This puts me to sleep and I teach it day in, day out. At the core of organizations that scale well, there is a muscle that does this. It produces high quality team-based decisions. And that's the beating heart of scalability and I can tell it. I can see it within Give me an hour in any organization. I'll tell you whether they're going to successfully scale or not. Because at the heart of organizations that are going to successfully scale, not sitting around where the person who's at the top end of the org chart is, but in every part of the organization, there are groups and teams making and executing high quality decisions.
That is so challenging for me as a natural visionary. When I hear you talk about this, it's so convicting. But I would love for you to unpack that a little bit. So if you look at an organization that is not doing high quality team-based decision making, and you're standing behind the glass door looking in at the boardroom, what does it look like compared to a company that is doing high quality team-based decision making? Because this is fascinating to me.
Well, here's the easiest way to think about it. I want you to think about the let's call it the senior leadership team in fun. It may not have even got that phrase in fun until later on. It might just be called management or them or the founders or the bosses. Typically towards middle, certainly by late fun, something will have evolved where we talk about and every organization's got a different phrase for it, but there is something that is the senior leadership
team, executive team, management team, whatever you call it.
Might be.
Yeah.
We've got a generic phrase that we call it T1, big letter T1 in predictable success, because everybody else has got different words for it. T1 in fun, here's what it is. It's the visionary and a bunch of enablers. It's not a leadership team. It's not a leadership team. They're not leading the organization. Now, I don't mean that in any way critically. I don't mean that. I'm not saying anybody was playing a con game when they used the phrase or whatever. It's just that seems to be the right thing to call them. So let's call them that. It's typically the visionary with a bunch of enablers. They may be very powerful enablers. They may be really good enablers. And I don't mean enabling in the addiction sense. They're there with a positive intent, which is, boss, whatever you need, just let us know. We'll make it happen. And so how do we select managers in organic growth during fun? And what are we looking for? We're looking for their ability to manage vertically. Vertical management. I will make you a manager because I need you to take away from me the need for me to talk to those 6 people because it was too much to do. So you manage that and enable me to achieve our vision. So if you think about it, I'm steepling my hands here for those of you who are listening in black and white. Think about it. That's what the management team looks like. There's the person here. Sometimes it's 2 people, very occasionally 3, but usually it's 1 person. And a group of folks who are essentially enablers. You walk into an organization. So if you look through the conference door, as I say, they're in a class conference room, you'll know by body language.
That guy's the visionary. That guy's the leader.
The way everybody's looking at whoever it is, guy or girl, by where the last word is. If you open the door when they're coming to the point where they're actually making a decision, you know who's talking last. You know who's summarizing. You know who's saying, okay, let's do this. So it's very much this. You get into an organization that's able to scale. The managers have learned a skill that didn't exist and wasn't necessary before, and it's called lateral management. Okay. And that's the ability not just to manage your people vertically, but to work laterally with the people who are with you on T1 to make what? High quality team-based decisions. That you actually are now a leadership team. That team is making decisions. And the visionary CEO or whoever it is that's the most senior executive, sure, they're the most senior executive. Sure, they got some things that are reserved solely to them. But if you watch that team through that conference window, you should not be able to see most of the time who the most senior, the MSE, most senior executive, again, every organization's got a different phrase, who they are in their interactions. In fact, that person should be there less and less and less, because they're not riding herd on everybody. There are groups of people making high quality team-based decisions throughout the organization. The MSE is doing what only they can do. That's one of the phrases that I use with the executives that I coach who are serious about scaling. I say, this is what your mantra needs to be. You need to be only doing what only you can do. You get that? You need to be only doing what only you can do. Now, let's start by defining that, because you've got a whole mindset that says that only you can do a whole bunch of stuff, which is once the case and is no longer the case. Or if it is the case, it shouldn't be. It means you haven't hired people who are competent enough. It means you haven't delegated out to people enough. So that's where the challenge is breaking this down to this and building this ability of lateral management where senior teams really, really are teams making high quality decisions.
Oh, that's so good. And it's so convicting in that picture of looking into the boardroom. I can see different teams I've seen. And you're right. In the organizations that are really capable of scale, it's hard to, is that the CEO? Is that the lead pastor? Is that the chairman? Is that like, it's really hard to know. Whereas, you know, in a younger organization or one that isn't going to scale or a less mature organization, the visionary is usually driving everything. It's fascinating. What are some keys to enabling high value team based decision making? What are because a lot of visionaries are hearing this going, so what are some keys for them?
So we've talked already about the need to build this muscle of lateral management. It means getting it means getting to the point where you know that a group of people in a room know how to make decisions. You know, the biggest low-hanging fruit that I have when I go in and start working with an organization is we put a decision-making process in place. We just simply agree how to make decisions. You know, I sit down with a group, you know, it's the T1 group, and the first question I ask is, how do you actually make decisions? What do you mean? Well, tell me something you got to make a decision about. So they'll tell me something. We're thinking of opening a second shift of our extrusion plant. How are you going to make that decision? Oh, we'll have a meeting.
Right.
And what'll happen? And everybody sort of looks at each other. And usually some version comes out of, well, you know, Joanna will decide. Joanna's the most senior executive. She's the CEO or the senior pastor or whatever. Well, how? How does she decide?
I'm laughing. This is awesome.
Not too sure.
Yeah.
So, well, how about we just put some... I'm going to come back to this thought in a minute. Here's why this is important. If you're going to scale, you know the one thing you're going to be doing gazillions of times, and you've got to do it gazillions of times, make and execute good decisions. And yet we leave this whole thing so vague and unthought through. So what I'll say is, okay, the rule at the moment is Joanna decides, right? Let's codify that and stack hands on it. Let's accede and accept to that. You know what one of the first things is that begins to happen is begin to think, maybe that's not very effective. What if Joanna didn't decide anything? And it's usually Joanna, who I've just made our token most senior executive here, who is the first to say this. Hey, what about I don't have anything to do with a spend that's under 25,000 or 5,000 or whatever? What if I don't have anything to do with these hirings of this role or this role? And what you begin to do is you begin to push decision making out, because we've just named it for what it is, which is at the moment everything comes in here, right?
Right.
Essentially, the T1, that most senior group, as we're just beginning to make the transition into scalability, you know what it is? It's the mail room. They think they're the senior leadership team. You know what they are? They're the mailroom, and people are walking by and throwing stuff in there. And sort that out, fix that out. There's no mandate. There's no agreement about what it is that they have got responsibility to decide on and what needs to go out. So we say, how do you make decisions? Okay, under these circumstances, Joanna will make it. Here's a couple of examples. What about if the team made that decision together? Because the team now know a lot. Okay, yeah, let's do that. The team will do that. How are we going to do that? I don't know. We just talk till something goes, well, what about if we have a vote? What? What about if we have a vote? Yeah, let's try that. Okay, do we need unanimity? Do you want everybody to? You see where I'm going here?
Yeah,
now,
100%.
What about timing? What about when you're having this? What about what data that you need available? Do you know that in my experience, 80% of every discussion a senior leadership team starts, more than 2/3 of the people around the table know within 2 minutes they're not going to make an effective decision because there isn't the right amount of data. But we don't have challenge words. We don't have the vocabulary to say, We should not continue with this. It's a waste of time. And you know what? You walk into most organizations that are struggling to get to predictable success, struggling to scale.
Yeah.
If you ask them, does it feel like you talked about this before?
Oh, yeah.
Don't you think you made a decision about this sometime in the last 3 months? Yeah, we did. What was it? Why did it not happen? So just codifying all that. So we have a simple process. I call it the 4D process: data, debate, decide, or defer. Get the data, debate it, decide or defer it, and we build an infrastructure around it. And there's a simple one-pager. And that one-pager, I'm not saying it's the holy grail and every organization should use it, but in a vacuum, in the absence of that, I give them this 4D flight plan. And what it basically says is every non-trivial decision you're going to make, you just run this process. It revolutionizes their meetings, revolutionizes the decision-making that they're going through.
So Les, I know you've got something for listeners at the end of this podcast, if they listen all the way through, a free chapter of your book, but I think you're willing to include the 4Ds, just a basic guide to that. Is that right?
Sure. Absolutely. So we'll tell folks at the end of the podcast how to get the first chapter PDF of Do Scale.
Cool.
And once they get that, then we'll follow up and send them out the 4D flight plan.
That's amazing. Speaking of flight plan, I want to come to that in a moment, navigating by instruments, not by sight. But I coach a lot of leaders who are stuck. In church world, I think it's the 800 to 1,000 barrier in attendance. And in entrepreneur world, I keep bumping into it at about the $1 million revenue mark, where they just seem to be like, I think 96% of all businesses never grow past $1 million, and something like 98% of all churches never grow past 1,000 people, even when they have the potential to do that. Now, some people don't want to grow. They want to keep it mom and pop. They want to keep a small church. I get that. But I'm talking to the leaders who are like, no, actually, we want to reach more people. I had an incident where I was speaking somewhere, and this guy had said to me, I knew this guy, and he's just like, yeah, I just don't know why we can't break 1,000, 700. And I'm giving a talk, and literally 20 minutes before my talk, he's running my keynote, my slides. They're setting them up, and I look, and in the booth is a lead pastor setting everything up in Pro Presenter. And I'm like, I know exactly why your church isn't past 1,000 now. I know exactly why. And the language that we use around here, and I'll call an audible on my team regularly, even as we've seen kind of explosive growth on the podcast, the blog, all this stuff that I do, is like, I got too many decisions crossing my desk. I need to release and empower. And we're hitting those walls all the time. I don't need to be included in. Can you talk about that tension? Like, how do you know whether too many things are coming back to you? Because it sounds like when you're talking about high quality team-based decision-making, that's not Joanna. It's not the CEO, the senior leader who is making all those decisions anymore. How do you know if you're that person and too much is crossing your desk?
Well, the example that you gave of the lead pastor setting everything up in Pro Presenter, I just go back to that mantra that I mentioned earlier, that if you're serious about scaling and you're asking yourself, am I only doing what only I can do? That just is so far out there that you've probably got there are individuals, we've talked about visionary operator, processor, synergist, and those styles. It can come in what I call a dominant version, which means if you can be a visionary, which is great, we need visionaries, but if you've got too much of the visionary, Jones in you, you actually become an arsonist. It's not helpful. It's just not helpful. Operators, that we need operators, but if you have too much of the operator in you, you actually become a maverick. I'm not coming to your stupid meeting. I'm not reading your dumb emails. Leave me alone. I've got a job to do. Processors, we need processors, but if you're too processory, you become a bureaucrat. We don't need bureaucrats. And even our synergists, if they're too synergy, they become people pleasers. They lose sight of the goals that we're trying to achieve, and will avoid conflict at all costs. Now, what I often find is that if your style is dominant, you need coaching. You need coaching. You can't do this yourself because your antennae are not seeing it. You're not picking up your radar. That lead pastor, you could probably tell him 100 times and he's not seeing it. So let's go back practically to the answer to your question in terms of setting boundaries. The first thing, if you're serious about scaling, that you've got to do is actually formulate what that T1 is. Call it whatever you want, executive team, senior leadership team, whatever it's going to be. You've got to sit down and think through who is that. And I don't mean who in terms of their names. One of the shifts that happens in moving from organic growth to scaling is we move typically from what I call from heads to hats. An organization in fun organic growth, it's all the heads. What's Jimmy doing today? Hey, Julie's the answer to that. I'll send for Andy, right? And of course, that's great and it's fun and that's never going to change. And we're humans and we love the human nature of this. If you're scaling, though, your head has got to be in, what does the CMO think about this?
Right.
What's our CIO doing here? And you might not use those titles. Maybe it's just, what's the IT role in this? So you got to move to the hats and you got to sit down and say, in a T1 for me, if we're going to scale this organization, what are the hats that need to be around the table? Maybe there's a perfect fit between the heads and the hats, and hopefully, in most of those cases. Some cases there won't be. That's one of the conflict things that scaling brings up, which is a recognition this person won't get us there. Yeah. Julie's wonderful, but she'll never be a CMO. Never. And we're crazy to expect that over, and it's not fair. Some of those hats roles may be roles that we don't even have yet, and we'll have to think about bringing them in over time. But you've got to define what they are. And here's a dirty little secret. I'm going to tell you the single thing that makes the biggest difference is that often in organizations that have recently been in fun, there's a secret shadow T1 inside what we call T1. Sometimes it's co-founders who, no matter how hard we try to do this, they get in the car and go home together at night. They go up to the gym together. Sometimes it's a mom and pop business or a family business where there's a secret T1 that meets at Sunday at lunch, right? Mm-hmm. Let me tell you something about churches that I often struggle with. We've got our visionary lead pastor. We've got our enablers. We decide we want to move to scale. We build a T1. We start building good leaders. And guess what happens every Monday at lunchtime? Pastor and the spouse get together, chew the fat, and pastor comes back with a rethought through answer to a solution or unpicks an answer. That means the T1 is actually the two people that meet on Monday at lunch. You know what? Fine. Recognize it. Name it. It's easier for me to say this in a commercial context, but when I can get two co-founders to say, no, don't do that disservice to your senior leaders. Call them T2.
Right.
They're T2, right? T1 are the co-founders. T2. It's one of the reasons why not having phrases like senior leadership team or management team, it's easier to see this, right?
Yeah.
Now, here's what happens in 90% of the occasions is that becomes a barrier because that T1's too small. And you start to recognize, okay, we're going to have to shift this. And let me get to the money shot in all of this. You're making serious headroads in building your ability to scale when your T1 starts organically without being told to build a T2. That's when I know an organization is moving from organic growth into scalability. That T1 is so humming, it's working so well that it's beginning to realize we need, I want you to think about this as a donut. Okay. Just not to get too complicated, the T in T1, T2, T3 stands for torus. T-O-R-U-S. A torus is a donut shape. It's just Latin for torus. I realized I couldn't charge much money if I started talking about donut level 1 and donut level 2. So I used T1, T. T1 becomes the senior leadership group. Right. You really are beginning to make some momentum when that T1 begins to realize we need people to do things here as
So it's
T2.
Concentric circles.
Yes, it's much, we're getting into a huge area here, but it's much easier and more intuitive to think about scaling your organization as well as thinking about the command and control org chart, which has got its use, the boxes, that's all fine. Yeah. If you think about it as concentric circles, it begins to become much more obvious that we've got this inner group okay, it can't be the co-founders anymore, just the co-founders anymore. It can't just be pastor and spouse. It's got to be a real T1. They work together for a few years. That's usually how long it takes, somewhere between 12 and 24 months. At that point, while that's happening, just about everybody in T1 is pulling double duty as being T2, right? So you've got an organization and there's somebody in T1 and they're, let's say, chief marketing officer. But they also happen to be the people who are running the LinkedIn account, who are, making the Instagram account work. They're also the T2. They're the manager, but they're also the person making it happen. When you're really beginning to get your skilling going, then T2 begins to take shape. You begin to realize, okay, we need to start putting people in place to do that. So one of the things that allows it to happen is to let the T1 people just think from a T1 perspective.
Right. And then you've got a marketing team that makes its own decisions, and the big directional strategic decisions move to T1, and the execution and the, sub 50,000 or sub 5,000 decisions, they move to T2. Is that right?
Correct. That is absolutely correct. And here's why that's so important, because when you think about it, before T2 has been developed to the point and we've got to the size and shape where we can begin to appoint people, because there's a financial, obviously, overhead cost in that. Before that, we've got people at T1 just learning to move away from this that level of the fun leadership stage when they were just empowering the key leader. They're moving towards becoming a group of people making decisions on their own. But they're all walking into those meetings with a T1 and a T2 hat, and maybe some of them even a T3 hat. And guess what happens as a result? T1, the strategic, big, important stuff. And then T2, the urgent, this customer's shouting, we've got 2 meetings to have, and so on. Which of them dominates? The urgent always beats out the important. And so the T1 in the early days find it really hard to get traction as a senior decision-making body, because every time we get in a room together, we got this cruddy T2 stuff that's
fighting
screaming at us, right? It's firefighting. And so we never build a senior leadership muscle because we can't get to it, because the urgent always outweighs the important. And we end up having to go off on a strategic retreat or do something, that's sort of slightly false or separate, and we come up with some great ideas and we bring them back to the ranch, and then all the T2, T3 needs hit us and we never get to implement. So it's a little bit of a, cause and effect thing there. Because you don't have the resources to just go build a T2 immediately, right? You've got to build and grow to be able to afford this. But in the meantime, you've got to acknowledge the fact that what that's going to do is it's going to mean that your horizons of focus on this high-quality team-based decision-making is always going to be being pulled down to the operational level.
No, that is so good. That's so rich. And I just want to say one more thing about sort of the secret T1 or the unspoken T1, because I think that's a very big issue where even if you met with who you think your senior leadership team is, and then you undo the decision when they're not in the room, that can happen at the board level. That can happen at the staff level.
Sure.
I would imagine that would make it really difficult to cultivate high-capacity leaders at a senior level of your organization. Is it true that top leaders don't like to stick around when they're told, hey, you're in charge of all operations or you're in charge of all marketing, but really you're not going to make any decisions? Like, that seems to be a very disempowering environment, is it?
It's very much so. You think about it in the fun stage where the senior folks are essentially enablers, as we talked about before. That all just comes with the territory. Oh, Joanna meets with her husband, who also happens to be, one of the founders and an investor. And we all know that every decision is provisional until Harry and Joanna have spoken. I mean, to give that as an example. Everybody just knows it comes with the territory. It's fine. But as you start to scale, and you say, oh, sure, I really need a high-quality CMO in here. I need a good, just a world-class music pastor in here, whatever it is. And you get those people, either you develop them internally or you attract them in there. And they see that they don't have any real autonomy. They've got expressed autonomy, but which can be whipped back at any time when, a couple of people go talk. That they're not going to hang around. They'll either just give up on their discretionary effort level and stop trying to make good, high quality decisions, because why would I if at the end of the day I just got to wait and see what you say, or they move on and go elsewhere. In a commercial organization, they typically you'll just up and go. That's that's not going to keep them hanging around. What I see a lot in faith-based organizations is people just quietly withdraw their discretionary effort, and
that's so well said. That's exactly what they do. That's exactly what they do. You will never have seen
that, Carey. You will have never have seen that, but I've
never seen that. But they quietly say that again. They quietly withdraw
their discretionary effort, because
exactly what they do.
The stuff that makes you who you are, makes you different, makes you succeed, all of it. Except that you luck into something for a short period of time, like, you make a technological breakthrough. Over the long term, everything that makes you succeed comes from the discretionary effort of your people.
It's true of staff. It's true of non-staff. It's true of volunteers. It's like, I'm just going to show up. I'll give you my 40 hours, my 37.5, my 45, whatever you want from me, but you're not getting more than that. Oh, yeah, that's so well said. Wow. And that's a disempowering environment. I want to talk a little bit less before we wrap up about flying by gut and flying by instruments. So I heard this in a scale talk once, and you and I have chatted about this before, but one of the big changes for me, because I think a lot of leaders who listen to this, we're very heavily entrepreneurial, a lot of our leaders listening, and you just kind of have a gut. It's like, whoa, something's off, or this isn't right. And pilots, you learn to fly by sight. And so you got to go up on a sunny day, that kind of thing. But you have to get your instrument rating, and you've got to learn to fly by instrument. And I remember there was a flight recently, I fly all the time, but there was a flight recently where I was sitting by a window looking out going, well, I hope this guy did well in that class, because I know we're about 100 feet off the ground and we're at the minimum level that you can actually land a plane. But I hope we show up somewhere on the runway. And leadership is like that, where you eventually, at a certain size, lose the ability to read accurately what's happening. And it comes down to dashboards and metrics and lead and lag indicators and all that. Can you talk about that as a key to scale? Because that's another transition I've had to make. And it's not an easy one always.
Yeah, it's one of the key elements in that what got you here won't get you there equation, which is that an absolutely essential part of early growth is having a visionary with great judgment. And, what I call in the book a golden gut, that, they just sniff it. Now, I actually break down in the book, we don't have time to go into today, but I break that intuition, that golden gut, that visceral management style, visceral leadership style into 5 specific things that contribute to it. And what happens as the organization becomes complex is that 3 of those 5 begin to get overwhelmed. And the most obvious one is just the availability of the relevant information. When you had 4 people working with or for you, you could see everything, you just had to look around. Even if you're running a virtual business, if you're using Slack or Flow or Asana or whatever, it's all there. I mean, everything is there, and you've got to make a decision. Yes, you're using your intuition and your judgment, which are the 2 things that you continue to have no matter what. But as the organization becomes more complex, you don't have all of the available information, but nobody tells us that, and we don't admit it to ourselves until, we make some decision that just falls flat. And I like to say that in fun, a board meeting's a ride up in the elevator. You get in, you hit the button, you got on the 11th floor, you've decided to, open an office in Chicago. And, by Tuesday of the next week, you're looking at offices because you met some guy and he's going to do a great job. All of that stuff, all that visceral stuff, that works. Not only works, it's vital. But then we have this transition point at which the stuff that's important is moving. It initially gets into your peripheral vision, and then it goes behind your peripheral vision. And at that time, you've got to be flying by instruments. So you've got to have decided what's the information that I need, how am I getting it, and how do I know that I can trust it? And that's part of what we talk about in Do Scale, is how do you put that in place?
I know it's different for every industry, for every sector, profit, not for profit, et cetera. But are there certain metrics that just should be on every leader's radar that you're like, hey, across all these industries, and you've run 42, 43 businesses, so, you've had some sampling in that. that it's like, obviously P&L, you gotta pay attention to that. You're tracking growth, but what are some that just like, hey, if you don't know this tells you more than you think it would?
I would say the one that stands the test more than anything else, because all industry, $1 million a year in one industry is very different than 50 million in another industry and so forth. The easiest way to get a sense of this are the number of FTEs, the number of full-time employees that you're working with. Up to about 20, no matter what industry sector you're in, 20 people, and I'm counting everybody. You can probably be confident that you'll get most things right. It starts to really come under pressure at 20. And by the time you're at 75, it's shot. I've never seen a leader with more than 75 people who didn't need to start using instrument navigation. Now, it doesn't mean to say that it instantly becomes, we shift from one to the other. It becomes, let's do both. Let's track both of these. And then what really good leaders begin to do is they begin to say, I'm not going to even think about what I think about these things anymore. We're going to go by what the data tells us. I'm going to restrict my golden gut intervention to these areas, because these are areas that I still know I've got some ability of judgment that we need as an organization. But most leaders, particularly visionaries, think that footprint is much bigger than it actually is. They think that they need to continue to be involved in things like setting up Presenter Pro that they absolutely shouldn't,
Right. No, 100%. I hear what you're saying. And I think it's a question of doing less and less and less, which a lot of leaders feel guilty of, right?
They feel guilty and also feel threatened and nervous. If a lot of the leaders I work with, when I say, only do what only you can do, I look at them and say, I can tell what you're thinking. You're thinking, well, what'll I do? I mean, doesn't that mean I'm only going to, do one thing a day? I say, no, you're going to do all of that so much better. And let's think, for example, of one of the things that only you can do. Only you can build succession in this organization, right? Yeah. Only you can do that. So, but you're never going to do it the way things are at the moment because you're too busy running like crazy. So one of the things you're going to get to do is you're going to get to, if you start delegating properly, you start defining what it is that you're doing, get yourself a high quality T1. Guess what you're going to have time to do? You're going to have time to mentor people. You're going to have time to coach people. You're going to have time to drive the vision of the organization deep into the organization. Well, the number one goal, this isn't necessarily only for do scales for any organization in predictable success, whether they want to just grow or scale. The number one goal a visionary leader has is to institutionalize the vision. Institutionalize the vision, depersonify it. Think of Apple. Think of what's happening now. Think of Starbucks. Schultz is gone. Think of Dell, where Michael Dell has had to go back 4 times. You've got to institutionalize the vision, and you cannot do that if you're making every operational decision.
That's so good. And I mean, we've talked about this a little bit on this podcast and on my blog too, but succession is a massive crisis that's brewing in the church. And it's also, I mean, very personally, my parents ran a business and I was their succession plan. And they did all right, but after 20 years, they kind of wound it up and, they did all right and all their employees got other jobs. But yeah, that's a really big thing. And so for me, to see our church firmly in the hands of the next generation 20 years after I started it has been amazing to see, but that's really hard work. And I don't think the church is doing it particularly well. And most businesses are first generation businesses. Do you know like how many businesses actually make it to successful succession? I think in the church, it's not very good.
The percentage has got to be below 20. I don't know I wouldn't be able to tell you what it is, but
it's not automatic, right, Les? I think is what I was driving at.
It's far from automatic, far from it. In fact, it's the opposite. It's rare for a successful transition to happen in any environment, church, cause-based, faith-based, commercial. Just to say a painful truth, I've seen it over and over again. Senior pastors, particularly if they were the founding pastor, find it very hard to let go. They just can't let go. And it's for great reasons. Their heart is good, but we've got to coach founding pastors into understanding that succession means handing over the vision, not maintaining some sort of super veto, not hovering around like Banquo's ghost. Part of the problem is you get a senior pastor who's led a church, particularly if they founded it and done so for some decades. Everybody loves him, loves her. Everybody loves Pastor Mike. And Pastor Mike probably has got I hate to say it, a reasonable amount of his identity tied up in that. And it's hard to let go. It's hard to let go. And I understand it. I understand it. What I fear, I'd say one other thing about succession in the church. It's too often presumed, particularly in fast-growing evangelical churches, to be also a family matter. I have to say that.
Yep.
I have to say that.
Yeah.
Often it is, and rightly so, but sometimes it isn't and shouldn't be. And there are a lot of great church leaders there who are going to either dissatisfied or going to leave because what's happening is what would, in an organizational sense, in a commercial organization, be just the lucky seed club. You happen to be the son of the founder of this plastic extrusion business, so of course you get to be the new CEO. Of course you do. Fine. That's all right. But that happens in churches too, Carey, unfortunately.
So one of the best pieces of advice that I got from a mentor, and this happened maybe 7 or 8 years ago, but he asked me, he said, Carey, he says, are you in Connexus, my church that I started, are you so entangled that you can't, like your whole identity is wrapped up in that? Or can you extrude yourself from that? Do you have a life independent of your church? And it was a really challenging question. And I kind of said, yes. But I'm so glad, Dave McDaniel, thank you so much for that question. Because, now 7 years later, the church firmly has its own life that's independent of my existence, and I have one that's independent. I still love our church. I go there every Sunday I'm in town, and preach there a lot too. But we are not one and the same. And I'm working on that with this podcast, working on it with the blog, working on it with this little communication thing that I've started. But that's a very tough journey, a very emotional journey, but I think it's one worth pursuing for sure. Les, I want to get to the special you've got. You've got an offer, some free stuff for our listeners. And then I'd also love, is there anything else you want to share about Scale before we're done? And then tell us about the book and tell us about the free offer.
Just in terms of sharing about Scale, I want to underline what you just said. That sort of cathartic choice is at the core of really understanding whether you're serious about wanting to scale. Yeah. And what I would say is there is absolutely nothing wrong with saying, you know what? I am this business. I am this church. It is me. We are the same. And that's how I want it to be, and admitting it. And then you stay in fun and you do that with integrity. What doesn't work is to do everything to try to get the organization to scale, but to retain the mindset and the behaviors that say, I am this entity and this entity is me, because the two don't jib. And even if you manage to somehow be successful in achieving some degree of scale with that, it disappears when you leave.
Yes.
Because you've got so much of that success baked into you. You haven't institutionalized the vision, as we talk about.
Oh, that's so good, Les.
Just underline what you said.
I one way I guess to think of it, and I'm increasingly thinking of it, is if you don't separate the two identities, then when you're done, it's done. Whatever that is, whether that's your company, whether that's the church you started, whether that's the legacy you're leaving. A lot of people talk about their legacy. I don't think I have a legacy, but then your legacy's done. Like, it's just great. You left something weak and whatever for the next generation. And I think with the church, number one, you're not supposed to do that. And number two, what are you actually building? Like, if you're building a company, if you're building a not-for-profit, are you building something that you hope will outlive you and will impact more people than you are capable of impacting? Then you got to scale it, and you've got to disentangle your identity from what you're doing. This is good. This is a little bit. This is free therapy, guys. all free therapy today here on the podcast. Okay, so tell us a little bit more about the book and then the offer.
So Do Scale, which is my fourth book, it comes out on June 4th, and I'd be delighted for all of the listeners to send them a free PDF of chapter 1, the whole of the first chapter. So all they have to do is text the word DO, D-O, just text the word DO to 72000, 72000. Or DO to 72000, and you'll get the free PDF. And then I'll make sure, based on our conversation today, that everybody that gets the PDF will follow up and make sure you get the 4D flight plan as well.
Oh, that's extremely generous, because I know normally you do not give that away. That is something you do when you personally consult with people. So that's extremely generous. So make sure you guys check that out. Also, tell us a little bit about ScaleCon. This is something you're doing for the first time, right?
It is. ScaleCon's my first annual conference. I do a lot of public workshops. I do private consulting and coaching, of course. But this is the first time I'm bringing a group of people together, and all we're doing is looking at the key principles in Do Scale. So that's on June 5th to the 7th here in Washington, D.C. We start with a little reception on the evening of the 5th, and teaching all day Thursday and Friday morning. Got some great speakers, people that I respect who have really helped me on my journey. We're talking about the whole 360-degree approach to scaling. Not only what does it mean inside your organization, which I'm handling mostly, and I'm releasing a fantastic new product called Your Scalability Index. Don't have time to go into that today, but everybody who comes to ScaleCon gets a year's access to that free. And then I've got a couple of great guest speakers who are going to come and talk about other aspects of scaling. Got Rita McGrath, wonderful professor from Columbia University who writes incredible stuff. She's going to talk about seeing around corners, seeing around the future.
Oh, wow.
We've got somebody a chap called Jeff Brody, who was at the other end of the equation whenever you were confronted with whether, where your involvement was. So for those of you, I'm sure just about everybody on the podcast knows, but Jeff actually runs Connexus Church. And then we've got Jen Gerasimus, who's a master trainer. She's my chief wellness officer, and she's going to share what the whole physical and mental mindset is if you're going to be at your best as a leader and lead your own team. So really looking forward to it. Everything is at scalecon2019.com, just scalecon2019.com.
Well, I feel like you have become, for me in my life, like a leadership insanity IV drip. So whatever you put out, I just want that refilled, because it's been so helpful, so clarifying. Literally the 7 stages of predictable success, the visionary operator, processor, synergist, and now your new teaching, your new material on scale, I know has become part of the leadership fabric for me, unless you're a gift to just so many people. Thank you so much again for being on the podcast. I'm so grateful for you, Les.
Thank you. Thanks, Carey. Thanks, everybody. Really appreciate it.